Hello, you're listening to another episode of the Spiritual Abuse Podcast. My name is Eddie.
And this is Joseph.
And tonight we're going to, I'm going to call this episode Ramblings and Resources. You may have noticed that there's been a little bit of time between this episode and our last episode. And we've had a number of life events come up. Joseph got a little under the weather. And then my mother got all selfish and decided to have a stroke. So that kind of took me out of things for a while. But just to let everyone know, my mother is fine. She's back home. She's doing great. And Joseph is doing great too. So Joseph, how's life been for you and Hannah?
Oh, it's going great. We just got a couple tattoos.
Oh, yeah, man. We know what we need to get on the Spiritual Abuse Twitter and tweet out the picture of your and Hannah's tattoo. I think that would be fantastic for all the...
They're pretty gnarly. I mean, it was my first tattoo and I kind of went all out. So
yeah, they've got big boy tattoos. I have a little tiny tattoo that I got from my 25th wedding anniversary, and my next tattoo, which is going to say freedom, by the way, for people out there listening, is going to be a little bit more prominent, probably not the size of what you and Hannah got, but that is good news.
But you don't think you can handle a whole forearm?
I couldn't do it. I mean, I virtually passed out on the little one, so I certainly don't need to get what you guys got. But and this is part of the ramblings that we're talking about. First of all, Joseph, one thing I want to talk about is that we've had several listeners. We're finding out that we've got listeners that from people we know. And Joseph, I can promise you that there's people that are still in the ministry that we kind of grew up in that are being forced to listen to our podcast and find out what we are saying and what's happening. And I know that's taking place, but we've heard from listeners. We heard from listeners out there who found our podcast, and the reason they found it is because they were searching for podcasts on spiritual abuse. And there's a lot of good podcasts out there, but they're hard to find. You have to search through things and you have to be clever. And that's why we named ours the Spiritual Abuse Podcast, so that if anybody's searching for spiritual abuse, they'd be able to find us. And we've received some emails and shout outs from people who basically said, thank you for sharing what you're sharing. And I think, Joseph, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's a collective group of people out there that feel like they're all alone or they can't believe something's happened. And then when they see or hear other people talking about it, they're going, yeah, someone gets it. They know exactly how I feel.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a unique but shared experience in this community. I mean, part of the healing process is making that transition of being completely dependent on a leader, maybe dependent on a community to kind of define everything for you and frame up your life. And once you decide to get out of a toxic environment, you go through this process of kind of finding your independence and constructing your own beliefs of the world. Your beliefs of the world may be relatively consistent with the group that you left, but it's still a different feeling, even if you don't change beliefs, to kind of be on your own and develop that independence. And you're right, you feel alone and you just feel a lot more vulnerable because you feel like you've strayed from the pack and you feel more vulnerable.
Absolutely. So, Joseph, I would kind of like to talk tonight about some of the resources and some of the things that we have done to help us heal through this thing that's called spiritual abuse. Now, I can't speak for you, but for me and my wife, it is a process. It's not like we've one day, hey, on March 3rd, 2021, everything was good. That's not quite how it works. It's a process, but I feel like we're doing the right things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same here. I was about to say, I mean, you said, what have we been doing to heal? I would counter that. I'm still healing in major ways, and it's definitely still a process. Yeah, for sure.
Well, one of the things that we are doing, and it's this podcast. This podcast is a vehicle for you, a vehicle for me, and actually a vehicle for the guests that we've had in the past. And I know we've got a slew of upcoming guests, and when you're able to talk about something openly and honestly and vulnerably, it's a game changer. And we have our guests that come on and they say that was like a therapy session. And as a reminder, um, neither Joseph or I are licensed therapist or psychoanalyst or psychologist or um, psychiatrist or anything like that. We're not counselors. We're just guys out here telling our story. But people they feel better when they take things that they've dealt with or maybe not even talked about and share it openly with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that's a big part of helping with the healing process is talking about it, talking about your story. It may not need to be a public setting. It may not need to be a public setting, but talk to somebody about it. Talk to somebody that you trust about it, because when you just keep it in your head and bottled up, it just grows, and it gets harder and harder to manage, and it makes you feel more and more alone. But when you put it out in the open, when you shine the light on it, that's when healing can start to come. So if you're not comfortable doing it in a public setting, I definitely encourage anybody, talk to somebody you trust, probably somebody who's not involved in the situation that you're in too, because you may want an objective insight into what you're going through. Um, but yeah, talk about it. So good.
That's a interesting sidebar here. I was noticing today in the news there is people in the group of Scientology who ex-Scientologists are suing somebody who abused them. Now here's the really evil part of Scientology, which is a made up religion from the mind of a science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard. Uh, Amazingly, the parallels between the things he did to control his people versus what pastors do in Christianity and other religions to control their people, they're pretty much the same, and there's control out there. But anyway, these women were abused by somebody in Scientology. They're out of it now. They sued the person, and because they were in Scientology at the time, they had signed contracts, and those contracts said that they could only uh, fix things through arbitration within Scientology. So get
Oh
this,
wow.
the court actually said, yes, those are legal and binding contracts, and they have to do an arbitration with the person who abused them, actually sexually abused them. And not only do they go through arbiters, but the person that abused them will be in the room while they're doing that. Now imagine that. That is just nuts.
Wow. That's unreal.
So, just a quick sidebar. So, another thing that I've now, before we get into resources, I've had to actually check myself, Joseph, and watch myself and make sure that my motives are good because I see some people post some things on social media, and I have to remember that um, people are still deeply controlled by people out there, and you've got to be smart and you got to be wise and you got to choose your battles, and you're just not going to win a whole lot of arguments with people on Facebook, whether it's about their pastor, their church, their president, politics. So I've actually had to pull back a little bit on trying to be a voice of calm and reason in people's minds because they just don't want to hear it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's amazing. This is definitely a very interesting time politically where you're seeing all those parallels, and people who are definitely still controlled by those groups and ideologies. It online sometimes can be a space where you can do something like that, but I mean, all you can really do is kind of just show through your life that you're free and that you're not crazy, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to judge those people though, because I once were a part of those people, and I once was controlled by, a pastor, and controlled by a strong control group. And I completely understand where they're coming from mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. And it's hard.
That is true. And by the way, something that Lisa and I've seen that you and Hannah have not seen yet was the special the other night with Oprah Winfrey where she was interviewing Prince Harry and Meghan from the royal family, and oh, what a mess that was. And as Megan was sharing her story, she actually had to deal with mental health issues and suicidal thoughts when she was within the royal family and living over there in London. And she had no one to turn to. And when she went to them, they said, "Well, we can't help you." Uh, and I know that there's a kind of a polarization in the United States right now on, uh, do you believe the royal family? Do you believe Harry and Meghan? But I can tell you this from someone who has been in a strong control group where every aspect, well, not every aspect, but a lot of aspects of what you say and what you can't say and where you go and where you can't go, and not being able to go to family funerals and other things like that, as they were sitting and talking about the level of control on their lives as royal people. I mean, that wasn't spiritual abuse, but it was still a strong control group. And man, I just had nothing but compassion and empathy. But that's just me rambling about the royal interview, and I can't wait for you and Hannah to see it.
Yeah, it's a bummer when you don't have cable. But Eddie, that kind of brings up a question I have for you. Since getting out of a strong control environment, have you changed lenses with how you view the world? Because it sounds like you view the world through the lens of someone who's been a part of a strong control group, and since you have been, you're starting to see it everywhere. Am I wrong?
Well, yeah, and I was listening to Lisa and I listened to a podcast last night before we went to bed. This is where people might judge us, but this is a judge-free zone on this podcast. So it's Leah Remini, who everyone knows is the actress from King of Queens, and she's been in other things. And she does a podcast with a guy whose name is Mike Rinder, and he was high up in the group of Scientology. He was one of the enforcers. He made people who left and said bad things about Scientology, he made their life a living hell. So they interviewed a woman who was in the other cult called Nexium. What is it? NXIVM
Yeah,
or whatever.
yeah,
Her name, I believe, is Sarah Edmondson or something very close to that. And, Scientology is one cult or a strong control group. It's for
mhm,
sure a cult. And Nixium, we all know that that was a cult. And they were sharing back and forth the stories of what they went through, what it was like when they left, how they have had to grow personally, what it was like with the interaction with their spouses, and how you go from an area of where there's strong control on what you think, what you say, what you do, what you don't do, versus to just being free. And Lisa and I were just going, oh my gosh, that's exactly how we felt. So we do now view the world through a different lens, and that is a lens of compassion, that is a lens of empathy, that is a lens of not trying to get everyone to think exactly the way we do. It's a lens of not trying to fix people's problems because you know for sure you have 100% the answer. And it's a game changer. And actually, Joseph, it's made my life a whole lot easier, a whole lot freer, and it just made me a kinder person.
yeah, absolutely. Um, I definitely look at the world through a different lens now as well. Granted, I wasn't in it as long as you have been. I mean, you were in there for 30 years. I was in there for probably 6 or 7. But even then, the effects were still there because I was just so, you know, so passionate about where I was and what I was doing. And I'm starting to see those trends in places that I look as well. And it's both troubling, but at the same time, I just feel like I am wiser now, and like I'm able to gauge people a lot better now, um, and a lot less naive. So I guess that's one small positive I can take from the growth of this. But yeah, it's definitely, I don't know, it's definitely bittersweet. It's really weird. I definitely see the world differently now. But with that lens and seeing that everywhere now, are there any groups? It doesn't have to be religious or anything like that, but are there any groups or cultures that you see that you wish the church was more like, that you go, you know what, that's actually a pretty healthy culture and I respect how they do that?
Uh, that is a loaded question. Well, if you would have asked me that a year ago, I probably would have said 12-step recovery programs are a
Hmm.
place where you go in and you're not judged, and it's a and most of them, believe it or not, are faith based,
Right.
with the belief in a God that loves you and has your best interest in mind. Um, but even in those, even in 12-step programs, you have to be very careful because you're going to be um, uh, pretty soon you'll be in a meeting every day, and they have sponsors and sponsees, and it's so busy that you've left one thing and now you're in something else that completely controls your life. And I think it gets people away from the fact that you're uniquely made, you have a distinct identity and a personality, and you lose your freedom sometimes. And I understand the importance of community. If there's anything else that COVID-19 has shown us, that a lack of community and a lack of being around people can be a very unhealthy thing, even for introverts. But I think it's just the general idea of just being kind to everybody regardless. And I know that's kind of a rambling, but we said up front this was going to be ramblings and resources.
Yeah.
So I'll get the rambling out here.
Well, I mean, for me, now right off the bat, I'm not saying, don't hear me say, anybody who's listening, that the church should be more like a business. That actually is causing more problems in a lot of what we're seeing today in the Western church. But what I appreciate and respect, because I work at Verizon, I've been working at Verizon for the past couple of years, and for a business, they actually run their company really well. Like as an employee, I really like how they respect people's voices, how they make space for people's voices, no matter how long or short you've been there. And even though it's a typical corporation's culture isn't as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. Again, I'm not saying the church should be run like a corporation or anything like that, but just the culture of Verizon has been really refreshing to me, of just how respectful they are of their employees and how they give their employees space to do their job their way and not the way that they think that they should be doing their job.
Well, I agree with you 100% because I work for Dell, which is a big tech company just like Verizon. And if you're not someone who is tolerant of people who aren't just like you,
Yeah.
I do not recommend you work for a company like that. So the thing I love about my company is that it doesn't matter if you're male or female, doesn't matter if you're white, black, brown, or any other color. It doesn't matter if you're old or young. It doesn't matter if you're Christian, Muslim, or atheist. Doesn't matter if you're gay or straight. You are respected. You are, uh, taken care of, and they want every single employee, regardless of what you do or how you look or who you love. They want everyone to have a voice and also to have a work life balance, which is,
Mm-hmm.
man, try to find a ministry where there's a work life balance.
Right.
That's just impossible. So I appreciate that. I'm very thankful for my job, and I'm thankful for the diversity that's there, and it's just a really neat thing.
Yeah. I agree. I agree.
So, just to let the listeners know, my wife's going to be coming home soon. When she opens the garage door, you're going to hear barking, and there's nothing I can do about it. But we're not doing this podcast in the studio. We're doing it in the comfort of our own homes. So you'll hear babies crying and dogs barking and garage doors opening and Joseph's coughing and all these
Oh,
other
I'll
things.
edit that
So
out.
no, no, I think that makes it real. So before we get to the resources, Joseph, I saw something on Facebook today that came from one of your professors at Oral Roberts University,
Mm.
the IT guy, Mr. Michael Matthews.
Oh, he wasn't my
And
professor, but yeah.
I'll say he was my professor
Okay.
then. How's that? But anyway, he's at ORU, and he actually put out a quote by Matthew Barnett, who is a pretty well known pastor in Christian circles. And here's what Matthew Barnett said: I found this very interesting, and it actually resonated within my soul. Here's what it said. I'm quoting from Matthew Barnett. The pandemic changed the course of the church. Raw missions is everything now. The slick church, modeled after corporate style leadership models, is dead. The church is now smaller, tougher, less glossy, and not as concerned about fitting in. It sounds like the recipe of revival. Um, I agree with some of that, but I do think it goes exactly with what you were saying about churches and the corporate business model that they've been running. Um, it's all about branding and growth, growth and
Oh yeah.
branding and growth, growth and branding. Uh, and then you get a church that's gets big, and we've seen a lot of things in the news lately on large churches that are just not a good thing. So, here's my call out to churches out there. Just focus on what you're called to do, which is caring on people, just taking care of people, loving on people. And there's my little sidebar.
Sure. I would say I would agree with that quote if you took out everybody in church leadership. That is not true for church leadership right now. Church leadership is doing everything they can to keep things going business as usual. And if anything, they're just getting more entrenched in their bad habits. Um, but
Oh yeah, they're feeling the squeeze. This pandemic changed the church,
oh yeah,
changed it, and pastors do not like it, and they're doing everything they possibly can to get butts back in the seats
oh
again.
yeah. So that quote about it being better, in some respects, I do not agree when it comes to church leadership. I think that their true colors are showing, to be honest. I do agree, though, that the old way of doing church is dead. I've had that view for the past year. Not going to get into that too much in this podcast because that's a whole subject. That's a whole other podcast. But I would agree with that quote if you were to consider the church the way that it should be, as in individual believers who are sincerely following Jesus throughout this country and beyond. I do think I do think people are choosing sides right now. I do believe people's true colors are showing, and I believe authentic followers of Jesus are really, you know, not just questioning what they believe in a sense of like doubt, but they're really solidifying how they personally feel about things, and they are getting tougher in becoming more autonomous and becoming less dependent on a physical location and less dependent on a single person to feed them of what they should believe. And I do think that's a beautiful thing. I do think it's the seeds for revival, because when you can independently follow God the way that you were designed and made to be, you really can live out at your highest potential and not be hindered by living under the thumb of church leadership, which, if we're honest, people do week in and week out in churches today.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Hey, while you were talking, I was listening, but I checked the progress of my wife on Find My iPhone, and she's 6 miles out, which should take about 10 minutes. I can get my Rex in that time for the
Okay,
recommendations.
go
So,
for it.
uh, okay, here's the first one. It's a book called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. It has the subtitle Spiritual Manipulation and False Spiritual Authority. It's by authors David Johnson and Jeff Van Vonderen, Vonderen. This is the first book that Lisa and I got when we left that spiritually abusing church. And here's the cool thing: it was written in the early 90s. So, we're hearing buzzwords right now about spiritual abuse and narcissistic pastors. And my wife always says, well, why are we hearing about this now? I think it's because people are actually talking about it. But the thing this book tells me is that this isn't a problem that's just existed within the last 5 or 10 years. They're writing about something that's just happened throughout the entirety of the church. And this book that was written in the 90s absolutely nailed Lisa exactly where we were. And it was an amazing book. It was such a freeing book to read. And that's my very first recommendation. Have you and Hannah, do you have any books in your library that you've used or checked out or anything like that?
I have one. It's kind of controversial. Basically,
While you're looking up that book, let me give my second
yeah,
book.
do it.
Okay. This is my favorite of the favorite books. It's called When Narcissism Comes to Church: Healing Your Community from Emotional and Spiritual Abuse. It's written by an author, Chuck DeGroat. That is Degroat. This book nailed exactly the situation we were in. But here's something else it did. It also nailed Lisa and my personality, because people will say, well, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you leave? We were just absolutely the perfect personality to be in place as yes men or yes women to help grow the kingdom of the pastor that we were working with. This book is an amazing book. If you were in a church in which the pastor was a strong, authority-driven, narcissistic control guy, this is a must book, worth whatever the $20 or whatever it costs to get it from Amazon. I highly, highly recommend it. You read it when you were at our house, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yeah, it was amazing.
It's a good book. Okay, here's the next book. This is a healing book. Sorry, I'm moving away from the microphone. It's called Broken Trust: A Practical Guide to Identify and Recover from Toxic Faith, Toxic Church, and Spiritual Abuse. Again, it's called Broken Trust, written by F. Period Remy, Remy, Diedrich, Diederich. Great book, great reading. Anybody who has been through something like we've been, this is another book in the arsenal. The thing that helps about reading these books, whether you get a hard copy in your hand like I'm holding right now, or if you get an ebook or you're reading it on your iPad or your iPhone, these books will help you go, oh my God, I am not crazy. These things happen to other people. I'm not the only weak-minded person who allowed themselves to be completely and totally, taken advantage of for decades.
Yeah, that's really good. Do you have any other resources? Or are those the books?
I
Oh,
have two
there you go.
more. Two more. Tiny little book. It's called Spiritual Abuse: Breaking Free from Religious Control. If you've ever been in a church where they handed out little booklets, this is not a big book. This is an easy, I guess, I don't know, it's bathroom reading is what you'd call it. It's more like a pamphlet than it is a book. But it's by June Hunt. June Hunt, Spiritual Abuse: Breaking Free from Religious Control. Amazing book. Not a whole lot of stories, but a lot of things in there that will help straighten you out. And then lastly, the most beautiful book. And I think I told in my podcast that in 2014, Lisa and I had a meeting with church leadership, which is one guy, and said, hey, we are done. Our time here is over. And then we were hoovered or talked into staying with the warning that if we left, it would affect the um, futures and destinies of our children. And boy, is that manipulation. But we actually took this book in with us to the meeting and said, here's a book we read. And we were told, well, you can find any book to say anything you want, which, of course, someone who doesn't want you to leave and wants to control you is going to tell you. But this book is called Boundaries. It's by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. This book, Boundaries, will help you not be taken advantage of by your family, your friends, your spouse. It's about setting up personal boundaries that allows you to work and live in that space that you need to be in. And it basically allows you to be able to say no. In the ministry that I was in, you could not say no. Well, they would say this: be willing to say yes, but If you say no, make sure you explain why, which basically meant always say yes. This book, Boundaries, is a game changer. So, all these resources I gave you are things that Lisa and I, and we've let other people read them too, that have really been very helpful resources to help us get free and know that we're not crazy, and to heal and to just be better people.
Yeah. And what I want to share, I don't have any like specific resources that I can just hold up and say, this is what you should read or check out. I think Eddie is an amazing resource for that. I think he provided a lot of good resources for us to start with. For me, I just want to just say for a few minutes, if you are deciding to step out of a strong controlled church, this was my experience moving out and still is my experience. And this may be what you might experience in the mental health sphere if you step out. Again, I'm not a therapist or a mental health professional. I'm just a person who is that's self-aware about what's going on in my mind. So I'm going to try to articulate what I went through. But when you leave these types of groups, just take a moment to reflect on what tactics they did on you, especially while reading these resources, and watch how they pop up in your mind as lasting effects that you are doing to yourself because you have been involved in that culture for so long. One thing, a big one, is gaslighting. I highly recommend to go back and listen to our podcast on gaslighting, but basically that is an attitude that makes you question yourself, perpetuates self-doubt, and you will likely be gaslighting yourself on your decision to leave months after that you leave. You will struggle with doubt likely, but mainly it's going to feel like you're stepping away from your pack, from your tribe, from your community, from your sense of collective identity. And when you step out, you're going to feel very vulnerable. In this vulnerability, it's going to feel like while you were a part of this community, you were driving behind a semi truck on a windy day. Because you were behind a semi truck, that semi truck was cutting the wind for you, so you didn't have as much resistance from the wind. But the moment you step out from behind that truck and start living life on your own, you're going to feel the full effects of the wind. And that's kind of like what it's felt for me once I stepped out and became an independent follower of God or an independent person. I felt all the winds of life hit me head on, and there was no community to shield me. So all of the issues that I was struggling with while a part of this community became heightened and more in the surface. So you may notice that things that you were struggling with in the past may come forward in stronger forms. You may notice that you may have negative thoughts about yourself. You may notice that you have negative thoughts that you may have never heard before, just new thoughts, attitudes, and emotions. Part of this is from you just rewiring your brain and learning how to be more independent. And some of this is just from the sense of vulnerability. And what I would encourage all of us to do is, in addition to getting these resources and listening to other people's stories to assure yourself that you're not crazy, is get professional help to process these complex emotions. But at bare minimum, in your mental health, prioritize journaling and writing down what you're experiencing, because there's such power in putting what you're experiencing to words. And when you journal it, it puts it on a page and you can kind of see what you're going through. But don't think that when you leave this community, everything's going to be perfect. There's a lot of trauma that you've experienced that's going to come to the forefront, and it's going to take a process to work through that, and it's going to take some time. So that's my advice.
That's good stuff. And don't think that people are going to like it when you leave either.
Yeah.
So if you've got friends and people that you've spent a long time with, and it's time for you to leave, they're not going to like it. And especially if you say anything negative about the pastor or the church, they'll shut you down very fast. And you're like, hey, I thought we went on vacation together, but that's not how it works.
Yeah.
It's not how it
I
works.
would say another thought. This is kind of a resource. If you still identify as Christian and still revere the Bible, after all of this experience, because I understand we have many different people from different paths on this podcast. Some people have been hurt so much that they aren't aren't ready to open a Bible anymore, or just have no desire to. So if you are in the camp of you still respect the Bible, or you still identify as Christian, what has been helpful for me is reading Jesus's interactions with the Pharisees, because it's very interesting how the religious leaders of the day, who knew the Bible front, back, left, and right, how Jesus really called them out on their hypocrisy and really put them in their place. And they didn't listen, they just got worse. And whenever I read that, it just assures me, one, that I'm not crazy, but two, it's just fascinating to just think about that encounter in light of today with what church leaders are doing today. And it's very interesting and worth pondering. So those are my last recommendations and thoughts.
Good stuff. One last story to end on. To we used to have to we had to memorize scriptures. That was part of our mandate on, um, and we'd have to say them out loud in our staff meetings. And one of them was Proverbs 25:13, which basically says, "Like the snows in the time of harvest, be refreshing to the soul of your master." You would think that when we first joined and we had to repeat those things out loud, that we would go, "Be refreshing to the soul of your master." That was just grooming to get us ready to do uh, what we were being groomed and trained to do, which was to do whatever the leader told us to do. So I found that today I actually remembered that. I'd kind of suppressed that scripture, but it came back up today. I was like, man, they're not even trying to hide the control on that one.
Yeah.
Be refreshing to the soul of your master.
Wow.
Holy moly.
And I would say, in the same vein of that, because that reminds me of something, a thing that I struggle with and still am watching in my life, after getting out of a strong control group, how you view authority, how you view people over you is very warped. So, for instance, in a typical employee setting, how I view my boss is very different than a normal employee typically views their boss. And thankfully, I have a wonderful boss who's not abusive, but I would I would just caution anybody who's coming out of this to take some tabs on how you view authority, particularly in your employment setting, because just the fact that you have a manager or somebody over you could be triggering for you, and you may watch yourself being very scared and intimidated by their authority. So just another thing to ponder about. So
Man, that you absolutely nailed that to the wall, like Martin Luther. We've had to. It's. I mean, that's very profound because we've had to relearn how we deal with people that are in positions over us as far as our employment. And hello, I'll get that. What we'll do is we can't. We've been trained to over communicate and kowtow and never say no, and then all of a sudden people are going, Are you okay?" Or what? Yeah, you don't need to type all that stuff out. You don't need to apologize for that. You didn't make a mistake. It's just a whole different way of looking at things. That was a
oh
great
oh
ad.
yeah, yeah, you I'm way too hard on myself in my job. Just way too hard on myself, because I'm thinking my manager is expecting perfection because my pastor expected perfection, and that's just not how people think in the real world. They're very understanding that you're human. So give grace to yourself because you're human.
It wasn't perfection, Joseph. It was excellence.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And
That's true.
and remember, if you've making a mistake is not a stupid mistake unless you make it over and over again. So there's all those things too. So
Gosh.
again, just things said to make sure that you fell in line. And oh, one last thing, uh, get in trouble. Uh, I listen to all these podcasts, and people were talking about not doing things or doing things to avoid getting in trouble. And I'm like, good gracious, here I am, a 54-year-old man, and I was doing things because I didn't want to get in trouble. You know how many times I've now been back working at Dell for 2 years? You know how many times I've been in trouble? Zero times. Zero times.
Exactly.
And it's just it's a whole different world. And that's that whole freedom that we're talking about. It's a mental thing, and it's a state of mind. So uh, I still have to sometimes deal with that.
Yeah, that's really good stuff.
All right. Well, there's our ramblings and our resources. And Joseph, it was good to be back with you. This feels great. I feel cleansed, and just want to encourage our listeners. We got some really good guests coming up over the next little bit, and we're going to be able to bring that to you. I, I'm looking forward, Joseph, because me and my wife Lisa and Joseph and Hannah and their son August and my other daughter Holly and her husband Cody, we're all taking off and going to Mexico in April. And these are things that I can do now. I can do these things. I can take vacations with my family. It doesn't have to be wrapped around if it's good for a ministry. When my mom was in the hospital with a stroke, I was able to go up and be there with the family because I'm 100% work from home. I can work from anywhere. And I get to, last Saturday, was able to go to the dog park with Holly and Cody and our dogs and their dogs. Normal living things that I missed out on for decades. And I will never take those things for granted again. Joseph, that's all I got to say. I'll let you take us out.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for listening to the Spiritual Abuse Podcast. As always, we're here for you. Even though we're not professionals, we're two guys that have been through probably something similar that you have. And we just want to hear your story and say that you're not alone. So feel free to email us at thespiritualabusepodcast@gmail.com or message us on Twitter at abuse_podcast. Feel free to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, a comment on YouTube. But we just mainly just want to hear from you. So we'll be looking forward to when you reach out, and we'll talk to you next time.